What's going on, everyone? Before we start this week's reef therapy session, I just want to let everyone know that in a month, August 6th and 7th, we're going to be hosting Reefstock Australia for the first time in 3 years. Now, part of the Reef Builders team will be out there, and we cannot wait to see our Australian reefing family again. We look forward to visiting with all the manufacturers, seeing some new products, checking out all the awesome Australian corals, giving away a lot of prizes in the raffle, and hosting some great speakers for you to learn more about reef aquariums as a hobby and the industry. So make sure to go to reefstock.show for more information, and we hope to see everybody out there. Reefstock Australia, August 6th and 7th. What's going on, Mark?
Prepping for a trip, so doing a little multitasking. Giving up on my... I'm going up to Maine to do a little backpacking.
Okay, all right.
Was hoping to get my basement tank in a state of goodness before I left, but I'm going to have to give up on that dream. But the upstairs tank is rocking, so, got to celebrate the wins.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is going to be the probably last reef therapy session for a little while because I'm going to Australia for Reefstock Australia in Sydney, August 7th and 8th. Go to reefstock.show for more information if you live in New South Wales or Sydney. But after that, I'm going to New Caledonia.
That sounds a lot cooler than Maine. No offense to anybody in Maine. I'm excited to go to Maine, but given the choice.
No, you can have fun anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Honestly, but this is kind of a long overdue honeymoon because I got married the early parts of the pandemic, and we're like, you know what, we'll just hold off on all the celebration, but now it's go time.
Nice. Very nice. Well, this topic for today is perfect for me because I'm struggling with a little bit of this myself right now, so it'll be good to talk about.
I don't think there's any repository for like every single tip and trick in the book on how to deal with unwanted growth of algae. Most of the algae, I think we'll touch on cyanobacteria and dinos a little bit, but those are kind of like different beasts. But we'll touch on them a little bit. But man, we have a lot to get through, and you and I love to take some sideways kind of tangents. So we're just going to drill right in. And every time I see someone post up on a local group or forum about algae issues, I'm just screaming at the screen. The first thing is turn down the lights. Just turn down the lights. You don't need them. Whatever brightness you have it set at, just reduce it. That's not going to eliminate the algae, but that's kind of capping it off at the knees. And you see this a lot too with like freshwater and saltwater fish only tanks. I'm like, turn the light off. Turn off the light and you won't have any algae and it's gone. Easy, the easiest fix in the world. And the halfway point for reef tanks or a marine invertebrate fowler or whatever, just reduce the light. Reduce the intensity, reduce the photo period, and or just turn down your whites or your reds, or just turn those off completely, because you can keep corals in pretty dim blue light for a very, very long time. And that's what I have to say about lighting. That's what I have to say lighting relative to algae. What do you think about that?
Yeah, anyone that's into freshwater planet aquariums, you've got the low-tech, low-light setups, and then you got the high-light, high-tech setups where you've got to supplement with CO2, right? And the way I always viewed it, and somebody's going to call me out that I have it wrong, but you have to supplement the CO2 in order to allow the more complex organisms, the plants, right, that you're trying to grow to actually compete with microalgae, right, that can reproduce and grow very quickly. Whereas in a low light type of scenario, you shift that competitive angle over to the slower growing plants. And in a reef aquarium, I think lowering your light output means that the corals will be fine. And you run into a situation where you make it less competitively advantageous for especially for microalgae and the like the green microalgae and the turf algae that just don't have as many limitations on their growth to suck up all those nutrients and take advantage of all that, photo energy. So I'm with you on 100% on that one.
And if I think it's important to outline that there's several different species of filamentous green hair algae. Enteromorpha is a common one. Bryopsis is another one that grows a little bit more like feathery. It's kind of the one that's easier to describe verbally. And Enteromorpha, which is a little bit more kind of usually lower lying and kind of turfy algae. But it's not the one that really causes like hair algae problems. Most of those are going to be in the Derbesia complex. And we're not going down to the species level. Those are just the genus level. But, lighting is the main energy source. And it kind of surprises me to this day that there is a coral acclimation mode in all of our LED lights, but there isn't a new tank lighting mode, right? Like an Instagram filter, it just pop up and it, for the first month or 3 months or whatever you designate, would make the light bluer and dimmer and shorter than what you would normally run. And I feel like that's 50% of the battle right there. Especially when you're starting a new tank or you're having a nutrient imbalance because something happened or your tank is new. Reduce the intensity, reduce the photo period, and make the light bluer overall. It's very hard to grow good groves and fields of green hair algae under strictly blue light that's running for 8 hours at like 50%. I think it bears repeating. Reduce your lights. That should be the first trick.
You know who had that right early on was Garf, Sally Joe, and I forget her husband's name, Leroy?
Leroy.
No? Yeah.
Sally Joe and Leroy Headley.
They had the Bulletproof Reef method, and this was back in the day where LEDs weren't a thing, and they were advocating for affordable reefs, so they were always pushing like the normal output fluorescent lighting.
Output fluorescent lighting with reflectors, Vitalites, right on top of the water of a very shallow aquarium.
Yes, and they advised that during the initial, phase of the tank to only run the actinic bulbs.
Yep.
And their argument was, it'll let coralline spread, right? And coralline, I know you don't like coralline, but,
I love coralline algae. I just don't want it in my tanks.
Yeah.
If I could get it to just grow in the rocks, that would be dope. But you don't get one without the other, right? It'll grow on your back wall, which you don't like. It'll grow on your power heads and crust everything. So no, I do love me some desmophyllum, but I only want it in one spot.
But yeah, I think their argument was, give the competitive advantage to coralline algae, let that spread. Where coralline grows, turf is not going to be able to get a good foothold, and then you can start turning on the whites, right? So similar sort of argument. I think they were more focused on the coralline success and less on the not stimulating the bad algae growth, but still same. They were on target in terms of advice. So yeah.
Can we say it one more time? I feel like this is 50% of the battle. If you have algae problems or you have a new tanks or some kind of imbalance just occurred where your skimmer just overflowed or a fish died and you didn't catch it, or you went out of town and something happened, your tank got algae covered. We're going to say it one more time for the third time for posterity. Reduce your intensity, reduce your photo period, and make your lights bluer. Turn down your whites, turn down your warm whites, turn down your reds. Any more to add on the lighting end of the algae control issue?
The only counterpoint I would say to that is if you're, I know we're going to talk about this later, but just if you're thinking about it already as a listener, is when you're talking cyano and dinos, which aren't technically algae, it may not help as much. I see a lot of folks fighting dinos suggest turn your lights blue, and so maybe it works for them. But in those situations, my take is you want some of the green guys to show up, right? So
We would both take green hair algae over dinoflagellates, right?
Any day of the week. Yeah.
Over cyanobacteria, which is easily treatable with any wide range antibiotic.
Yeah.
Yes, please. So yeah, it bears repeating that we're speaking mostly about true algae, right? Because there are known treatments for cyanobacteria, and it's not a big deal. And the dinoflagellate issue is kind of a new one, and we've discussed it at length throughout other sessions of reef therapy. But after the lighting, and which is a big part, the second most important thing you can tackle, and it's probably the angle that everybody kind of approaches hair algae problems with, is nutrients. Do you want to tell the patients about how I sent you this note and you had to listen to my super long text messages with everything?
Yeah, I usually fit in some kind of exercise between when my workday ends and when we meet up to do these sessions. And Jake will usually start penning down, or Apple Notes and text messages, some of the ideas or some of the stuff that are good talking points for these podcasts. And I'm running, and I'm like 2 miles into my run, and I've got my Apple earbuds in, and Siri lets me know I got a text message from Jake, and it's like, would you like me to read it? And I'm like, yeah, read the text message. And then it's like 2 pages of algae control advice going into my ears for the next mile. I had to laugh because it was actually quite entertaining, because it gave me time to just think about each talking point while I was running. But yeah, it was pretty funny.
So I tried to put these in order, and we're talking about nutrients, and the biggest nutrient is going to be phosphate, nitrate to a lesser degree, but it doesn't help when it's really high. Silicate is one that we used to talk about a lot more, and there were specific RO membranes you could purchase that had a higher rejection rate of silica. And the other one that is becoming known in the aquarium hobby as a important element in reef aquarium chemistry, but not so much as a fuel for algae, is carbon dioxide, right? And so it's just like fire, right? For fire, you need fuel, you need heat, and oxygen. You take any one of those out or reduce it significantly, you don't have fire, right? And so I feel the same way about algae. You reduce the light, or you reduce the nutrients, or you reduce the CO2, you don't get algae, right? But if you can tackle all of these things a little bit, you will make significant headwinds. And so, man, I just got a message from like a long lost friend a couple weeks ago about a tank that become just a grove of hair algae growth, and she asked me what to do, and I'm like, well, first thing, it was really long and silky and flowy. I'm like, first thing is just suck it out. Just suck out as much as you can, do a water change, and a hose will help. Having some rigid tubing will also help. I don't know if you remember this, but there was an aquarium company that made a little mark on the aquarium hobby for a little while. I think it was Kong. It was just called Kong. And they had like a really unique Kalkwasser doser. And they had it was basically like a power head, which had didn't have an impeller, and it would wind up the hair algae like spaghetti.
Oh, wow.
Do you remember that thing?
I don't, but I remember some people doing it with like toothpicks and stuff.
Yeah. I do that method a little bit more in my freshwater tanks. That's where I tend to have a little bit of staghorn algae growing. And so for me, like, algae is more of something that I combat in my freshwater tanks and my saltwater tanks. But the first thing, man, do a water change and remove detritus. Don't just remove pure water. Find the concentrations of funk. Detritus is always going to build up somewhere in your tank, and especially in your sump. Even with an automatic filter roll, there's always going to be like a little overflow from the emergency drain, or a little bit side flow from the automatic filter rolls, or same with your filter socks as they get clogged up. And I know there's some reefers who just have this weird flex of saying, oh, I've never done water changes. And usually their tank looks like it, right? But the sump just gets totally ignored, right? Until people put a lot of attention on their sump when it's brand new. and they want to show it off when all sparkly and clean, but they don't even put a light on it. And then over time, there's a lot of buildup that happens inside of there, underneath your filter salt compartment, inside your protein skimmer, right? You can't get everything. You'll get detritus in there. So I think my first piece of advice is change like concentrated amounts of water, really targeting the detritus where it's building up in your tank and in your filter compartments. And the overflow box. Don't forget the overflow box, man. You'll get like inches deep with detritus back there.
Yeah. So, my take on nutrients, and if we're talking nutrients, like silicates, limiting those if you're having just nonstop diatom blooms, okay, sure, I get that. But, that's usually a temporary problem that goes away on its own. Because diatoms have a knack for just blowing themselves out of existence in a way. Not out of existence, like if you put water under a microscope, of an old tank, you're going to find diatoms. But I mean, they just sort of crash on their own, right? I do notice with diatoms, the CO2 thing, particularly the sort of traditional method for some of the brown, simple algae as well as diatoms was dosing kalkwasser and just spiking your pH a bit. Not to a deleterious effect to your corals, but just starting to run your pH a little bit higher than normal. And that I've seen that really knock some of those simple things down. In terms of fixing an algae problem by fixing, and I know Richard Ross has talked about this quite a bit too, and he, especially around phosphates, but just fighting an algae problem by reducing your nitrates and phosphates, I never had any success with that, except for the fact that when I first experimented with carbon dosing back when it was just vodka dosing and there was no commercial products, the other things that stopped growing were my coralline algae, right? And my corals got lighter. And so it's like I'm not only limiting the algae from these building blocks, right? But I'm limiting everything else too. However, if your nitrates and phosphates are through the roof, or you've got latent phosphates that are accessible by turf algae in your rocks, for example, I think then sort of bringing them back down to earth, bringing them back to reasonable values does help.
Can you throw out some numbers?
Yeah. I don't really have a good idea of a number because when you hear about different people's phosphate and nitrates and numbers, I've seen really beautiful tanks with different numbers, right? But I mean,
absolutely. It's all about finding that balance and the equilibrium, right? You can, but if you're battling algae, that is kind of your primary objective. And yes, if you reduce the nutrients, you're going to reduce everything else. And phosphate is a more lower hanging fruit to tackle than nitrates, because your nitrates build up, 10 times more. So let's just throw out some numbers. 50 ppm can be I'd say I'm going to say like some kind of upper limits for a healthy reef tank of about. This is really being generous, right? Very liberal, like 1 to 2 ppm phosphate, and like 50 to 80 ppm nitrate. My takes run 0.000, right? But if you limit it and then you cut it back and you get the algae under control, you can get back to those numbers, but not have an algae bloom. But you have to employ some of these other things that we're going to discuss earlier, as far as like finding that balance in your tank and your corals and your fish population.
Yeah, one way to look at it is if you bring it, like I'll just pick magic numbers, right? If you get your nitrates from 80 down to 10 parts per million and you get your phosphates into a more reasonable range, I think those are byproducts of, I'm going in there and I'm making my aquarium conditions better. Not only better for reducing the rampant growth of algae, but better for corals, right? Because I do feel like there's got to be a point where phosphate becomes rather poisonous to calcification. We all know that nitrates is the least toxic thing to fish compared to nitrites and ammonia, but at elevated levels, it does start to not be so good, right? So I feel like and I don't want to jump the gun, but I love the word that you said about going medieval. Just if you're getting in there and you're siphoning out all the detritus and you're going in there with a toothbrush and you're manually being an herbivore, right? You're going in and you're harvesting the algae and you're just kind of giving your tank a tune-up and then you just stay on top of it. I think that your nutrients are going to start to go down, but again, personally speaking, I've never had much luck fixing an algae problem with GFO, or like I said, carbon dosing seemed to be really effective at curbing nitrates, but
getting last little bit of phosphate out from any form of carbon dosing. I think Nopox is one of those really good ones, because I know from like 10 years ago that they put some cofactors in there to inhibit bacterial blooms from that particular carbon. But it's really great at getting the nitrates down, and it's just a lot more effort to get the phosphates down. But after the water change, the next thing that comes to mind is making sure your protein skimmer is operating optimally. Right, and the natural tendency is to think that is mostly for removing nutrients, right? Skimming out the organics and the proteins of your tank. And yes, that's also important, but a properly functioning protein skimmer is really going to help to degas the water and get more of that CO2 out of the tank. And keeping your pH up and your alkalinity up is going to remove a lot of carbon dioxide, but it's also going to, if you increase your alkalinity, you're going to shift the balance of the carbonate cycle more in favor of having less free carbon dioxide. This is the kind of the key word. So if you keep your pH above 8.2 at a normal alkalinity of like 7 to 9 degrees of carbonate hardness, that's just one less thing for the algae to grab onto. And that might be one of the best things you can do. It's funny, actually, in saltwater, you have to go the other direction. You have to make it more acidic to reduce algae growth. And so it's just funny that in a saltwater tank...
Oh, you mean freshwater?
Yes, freshwater.
Yeah.
You make it more acidic to reduce algae growth. But in a saltwater tank, you want to make it more basic because there's less carbon dioxide available. And... oh God, I had a point to finish that up with, but it will just help to just knock back. Oh, I know what I was going to say. It'll help knock back the free carbon dioxide available to hair algae. And this is one of those things you can't sell a product for, man. I really feel like the reef aquarium industry, and this might be a whole session in the future, the reef aquarium hobby and industry is being led by the industry, right? If you can't sell somebody something to reduce the free carbon dioxide inside their aquariums, then why even talk about it, right? But you don't have to worry about making free carbon dioxide unavailable to the Symbiodinium inside the zooxanthellae inside of your corals, because they can just get that from the coral, right? So if you reduce it from the water, your algae, your Symbiodinium zooxanthellae inside the coral, they can still get it, and they still get some from bicarbonate at higher pHs. And so this is one of those kind of little talk things, because it's not nearly as lucrative as selling someone an algae scrubber or a media reactor and the recurring sales of whatever phosphate media you want to use. But getting your protein skimmer in peak working condition is going to remove some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the heavy proteins, some things that are just nastifying your tank. But it's also going to help a lot more in degassing your aquarium and pulling air in from outside. That's a conversation that more like the stickheads talk about, the acro guys, as far as like getting the corals to grow faster. But I just feel like it's good basic practice to keep a high pH and pull in fresh air from outside a room where people are hanging out in.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously when you add kalkwasser, it does a bunch of different things, but spiking the pH with calc or just incorporating some kalkwasser dosing, not so much to tackle your alkalinity demand, but just to say, okay, well, I was running at 8.3 and now I'm running at like 8.4, right? Which is exponentially higher. I have successfully beaten certain blooms that way, and I wonder if it's the CO2 angle versus like, oh, it's precipitating phosphate or, something else. And even
probably a little bit of both.
I think it's Julian's algae book. Shout out to his book. He actually brings that up as a treatment for some of the algae in that guide he used to. I don't know if it's out of print these days or not, but anyway. I agree with you.
That's one book that I don't have, but when I was coming up with this list of all the things that I know what to do, I pulled out the Modern Coral Reef Aquarium, the Reef Aquarium, and a couple other more obscure volumes. And both the Modern Coral Reef Aquarium and the Reef Aquarium Volume 3 specifically talked about how a depressed alkalinity will contribute to algae growth. But again, I feel like the industry is leading the hobby by trying to sell a media reactor or an algae scrubber or all these different treatments when it's like, just add a little bit more buffer. Start dosing a little bit of kalkwasser. You'll make some of that CO2 less available. And there again, it's just like every other thing. There's not one silver bullet. There's a couple of silver bullets that we'll mention at the very, very end, but those are kind of like a last resort. And if you do those things, those silver bullets, but you don't have the proper practices in place, you're just kind of doomed to just going back into the cycle where the algae will just come back. But as on the topic of low-hanging fruit, as far as reducing the lighting, you can also reduce your feeding. If you are human and alive and listening to this podcast right now, I guarantee you are feeding your fish more than they need. That's just a fact, right? I feed my fish just such a small amount, just enough to keep their belly full. And some of the fish grow slower, like the larger fish that don't get as much food. The smaller fish tend to grow a little bit faster. But reduce your feeding. I don't know how many times I've been to like a reef aquarium shop, and I've seen their like frozen food slop, where they just pop like squid and shrimp and oysters and squirt a bunch of stuff in it, and they just feed that all day long to all the fish and all the displays. I don't feed mysis shrimp without rinsing it. Like brine shrimp is kind of clean enough. It's not really oily, so you don't have to rinse brine shrimp or bloodworms or live blackworms. But mysis shrimp in particular is really oily, and that is going to break down and contribute to your aquarium. And it's also going to shut down your protein skimmer sometimes for like 6 hours if you just pop a basic cube of mysis without rinsing it. So I put all my mysis, when I do feed mysis, it's about once a week or more often for like some new introductions. I put it all into a taller glass, and I rinse it out in fresh water. Right? Normally you wouldn't do that, but I found that it sinks just fine. It is already a freshwater shrimp, so rinsing in fresh water doesn't change its density so much. And I'll just rinse it once or twice and just let all the good food particles settle. And then you have like this pinkish orange opaque fluid that you would just never add to your tank if you weren't feeding the fish. So reducing your feeding, rinsing your frozen food really helps, and cutting back on coral feeding, right? If your coral, like we kept and grew corals for so long without ever feeding them, right? Your corals are not going to starve ever unless they're NPS corals when you stop feeding them, right? So you could just suspend that feeding. And then don't even me started on these so-called phosphates-free coral foods, because like if it doesn't have phosphate, it's not really food.
Yeah, sort of the building block of life, right?
Yeah, just maybe. That's what astrobiologists kind of look for, is like hints of phosphine.
Is there phosphate there? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And definitely cut back on the broadcast feeding. I know it helps your coral, but unless you're a coral farmer or you're trying to spawn corals, you're not going to really see a huge difference from limiting or suspending your coral feeding, especially the broadcast feeding.
Yeah, again, I think the goal is to have a more tightly organized nutrient web in your tank, right? So if you're the dump truck that's dumping in a bunch of nutrients, you're not helping the cause, right? It's sort of where like scrubbing the nutrients out, to me, long term may help, but it also may put you in dino cyanozone, or it may impact the other organisms in the tank. But I feel like there is something to be said for import and export, right? Like having that skimmer tuned really well.
Dude,
Be honest with yourself. Like, are you letting that neck get gunked up and then just staring at it for 2 weeks before you actually clean it out? Or, just for fun for 2 weeks, man, run that skimmer wet as hell where you got to empty it every day and just see what it does to your tank. Right.
A la Ben Johnson.
Yes, exactly. I'm doing that on my basement tank right now, and because I've got a bit of a dinoflagellate issue, and it's funny. It's like it's skimming out the dinos at night. I'll empty the cup, and it's like, oh, there's not much for me to remove, man. And then when the dinos get into that more free swimming zone, I come down in the morning, and it's just a cup of brown, fishy, dino-smelling goo.
In the morning, you can smell it before you see it, right?
Yeah.
You can smell that marine ocean smell. Man, as we're talking about this, I feel like there's so many old school tricks that we've already nailed down, right? Nutrient export. That's a word. That's a combination of words I haven't heard in a really long time. The whole reef aquarium hobby was based on input and output, import and export. Right? Nutrient export was an important term in the reef aquarium hobby for so freaking long. So yeah, it's all about that balancing that nutrient export. Along the same lines, if you're having algae problems, using an automated filter roll is really helpful, because just like wet skimming, it's just getting all that stuff out before it can build up, and it's even catching those algae spores. But if you're using filter socks, just change those or clean those 2 or 3 times a week instead of once a week or every 2 weeks. It's kind of like really fundamental stuff. And then we've talked about this a little bit, but create a little bit more of a manual storm mode, right? With the power head. If you're having algae issues in a new tank, and that's called the uglies, right? That's just kind of like the early stages, and then diatoms tend to take care of themselves. But if you have an older tank that is having a persistent algae problem, and you've already kind of hit some of the low-hanging fruit, and if you have got some classic hyperporous Pucani wild live rock with nothing but pores to catch all the detritus, you need to get in there, because your water flow can only do so much. We used to talk about reef tank ecology a lot more. That word is gone, stricken from the reef aquarium vocabulary. And you went to school for ecology, so you understand it's just the whole of the system and how it functions. So yeah, you want to have good, proper water flow for your corals, but you want to have a little bit extra and consider how that flow is being driven to your overflow to kind of get it down to your filtration zone. So if you have just barely enough to make your polyps sway, that might not be enough to constantly export the nutrients. Right? And we've talked about this also. One of my newer tricks, which is not that new, is, once in a while, about once a year, I will do the storm mode, and then I will also add either a regular air stone or a wooden air stone to a tank and turn the whole thing to a protein skimmer, because that air can trickle through the really porous rocks and just elevate just funk and crap that's been stuck inside for over a year. And we're methodical at the Reef Builder Studio as far as like keeping every tank just kind of feeling like it's 3 to 6 months old, right? Once the growths get past a certain point, we're like, all right, we need to roll up our sleeves and kind of get in there. So, you could do water changes, have a good protein skimmer, knock back the lighting, knock back the CO2. But if you have this huge reservoir of nutrients in your rocks, or in any kind of sand bed that's just constantly leaching out, you're just swimming upstream. It's not going to work.
Yeah, and that's that. I mean, if you find yourself with an algae-ridden tank, that goes back to that going medieval that you said in your notes, right? Is be the herbivore, remove as much as you can, do a little bit of that daily, and create those storms. One thing that I don't know, the verdict is out that I'm sort of tinkering with is some homemade marine snow, right? And not marine snow, the term of the flocculants that corals are capturing, but basically like I think it's Coralizicht makes like a snow product that's good for clarifying up a tank, right? And it's just calcium carbonate powder in water.
Hmm.
And so I saw people experimenting with that, and I'm trying that out on this tank where I create that storm, and it's really cloudy, just gunk floating around, and then I dose a little bit of this calcium carbonate, and that becomes another binding agent in the water to pick up like things that might be a little too small, and then let the filter roll and the skimmer pick it up.
So that's an awesome point. And with or without the marine snow, you would be shocked at looking at your tank, then creating one of these storms with or without the air bubbles and letting it just filter out through a filter sock or automatic filter roll, how much clearer it will get after you create this condition.
Yeah.
It's quite surprising because we do it all the time, and man, stuff clears up really fast because you have a lot of particles in the water and they'll stick to each other. With or without a flocculant makes it easier for mechanical filters to pull them out.
And you don't have to use, the other thing I was going to point out too is if you want to get in there with a brush and a hose, right, you don't have to do a water change to leverage the power of a siphon, right? Because another thing that I've done a million times is I get a really small micron filter sock, I clip it in on the inner wall of my sump, and then I just siphon into that filter sock, and then I just go to town on my tank, right? Mm-hmm. And you can do that daily, right? Like you may not want to mix up fresh salt water and do daily water changes, but you want to get a lot of this crap out, and you want to go at the rocks with a rough brush and all that crap, and then siphon out whatever you dislodge. You can do that every day for like 3 weeks straight, and you're just, again, and keep in mind that the algae that you're harvesting up has all of this stuff that it needs to grow, and it's, you know, like not just phosphates and nitrates, right? But it's, so you're exporting, right? So you're also removing in that biomass the very things that if those things broke down would make those things available for future growth. So it's really easy to do, and it's really quick. And I mean, I've been on work conference calls where I, just real quick did it for like 5 minutes, and I'm talking and nobody knows what I'm doing, and done. So
I don't get that much hair algae growth primarily. So let's two things. One, it's going to be really hard to have an algae bloom, like an algae infestation in a tank without a sand bed. I mean, that is, like, I know you like it. I know it looks pretty, but it's maintenance, and we've talked about that. So I feel like reducing or removing your sand bed is better than siphoning it out. It's just going to trap funk, and it's going to trap spores and amptasia and hair algae. So that's one of the big things. But just like you were talking about some of the manual removal, I don't have so much hair algae, but my emerald crabs are slow, and they will knock back some bubble algae growth. But over a 6-month to a 12-month period, man, there's a couple spots they can't hit, and I will suck it out, directly with an actual water change in a bucket, or just like you mentioned, use some kind of mechanical filter, either a filter sock or kind of a mesh sock, and just kind of remove those, because your herbivores can't get everywhere. They just can't get to every single spot. You got a little light bleed into your overflow box or right at your return nozzle. Those are spots you just have to hit them. Your fish don't want to like beach themselves to try to get a little bit of turf algae on the outflow. And you can tell, because I know you've seen this, and I know many of the patients listening right now to the session of Reef Therapy will have noticed when you turn your flow off, some of your herbivores, they'll go to the nozzle because they don't have to fight anymore.
Your stream pumps or your gyro pumps, like if they're turned off during a water change, your tanks go to town, right? They're like, woo-hoo.
Oh yeah, they're like, some new real estate. But I want to save the herbivores for last section and keep focusing more on the nutrients. And so I'm a big proponent of just make it easy on yourself, remove the sand bed. And now it's time for your spiel on how an algae scrubber is going to basically concentrate that undesirable algae into a place where you can more manage it. Tell us about the algae scrubbers, aka refugiums.
So I'm a huge fan of both algae turf scrubbers. I love me some Walter 80 books. I have an original inland aquatics turf scrubber that I cannot get rid of just because it's just a piece of nostalgia for me. Yeah, I don't know. I've said it before on previous podcasts that for me, my tanks sort of lock in when I'm actually growing some algae somewhere. I don't know why that is. I don't see how. I don't see it as a way of out-competing the algae for nutrients, because you got to have nutrients to grow the algae in your turf scrubber or refugium, right? So I think I've thought about this so long. Like, part of it is it, that these algae release terpenoids that inhibit the growth elsewhere? Is it that you don't usually have a healthy variety of algae problems, right? Like, usually it's one dominant species that it's succession, right? We talk about ecological succession, and it's, if you have a Bryopsis issue, you have a Bryopsis issue, and sure, there may be a couple of patches of Valonia or something else, but there's a dominant species that's like, hey, I'm here. And I feel like when you grow a Cato refugium or you grow a turf scrubber, you're choosing where and who that dominant species is.
Amen.
And that somehow makes it's, that wake of that dominance shows up in your display as, hey, there's no algae there. And that sounds kind of crazy, and people are probably going to roll their eyes at that, but
just like a forest.
Right.
It's just like a forest. You get grass, then you get shrubs, then you get weedy trees, and then you get old growth forest. I'm oversimplifying. I'm sure there's a forest ecologist out there who keeps a reef tank who's just screaming silently, but it's true. It's absolutely true. And on those same lines, like, Valonia will blow up before it settles down. And then you'll just kind of a low level growth of Valonia that you just have to kind of get in a couple places manually. But yeah, you're totally right.
Yeah, I mean, because it does export, right? Because you're going to harvest that algae. So you are removing nutrients. But that algae needed those nutrients to grow in the first place. So again, maybe again, like I hate this analogy. I don't know how else to put it. But maybe you're causing that nutrient web to be a little more tightly wound, and there's just not a bunch of shit floating around. Excuse my language, for everybody to consume. I don't know, but like, my take on it is, you just willingly chose this turf algae to dominate in your sump, and you
played God a little bit.
It's boss now. Yeah.
You played God a little bit. You just kind of shifted where the algae growth is going to happen. If you have it on a 24-hour light cycle, or RDP, reverse daylight photosynthesis, you're concentrating where the CO2, the nutrients, and certain traces are being focused up. I think the only, downfall, not a downfall, but one of the shortcomings to an algae scrubber or a ketomorpha reactor is, once you get the nutrients under control, then you have to think about how to keep it up.
Yeah.
Right.
Now you got to take care of something else.
Not enough people talk about using an algae scrubber for a little while.
Yeah.
Right? We used UV sterilizers for a little while, and we're going to talk about that when we get at medieval. We talk about using a UV sterilizer for a little while, or ozone for a little while, but we don't talk enough about, like, just an inline algae scrubber that you use for a little while until you get stuff under control, and then you get rid of it. Because what will inevitably happen is you will get ahead of the algae, but now you have a different algae farm that you have to look after. You got to dose iron and manganese and a couple other things to keep it really happy. Otherwise, it's going to kind of flail. I've seen too many people showing off their algae scrubbers with, like, the sickest, weakest algae that I've ever seen. I'm like, dude, if it's not dark green, either you don't need to be running it or you're not doing it right. So the algae scrubber, it's almost like growing a different kind of thing within your reef aquarium, and it's not open-ended. And we've also talked about different forms of algae that grows on the screens, or different species of ketomorpha that grow more ideally into those kinds of environments. But Anything else you want to add about the algae scrubber side of things?
No, I mean, I what you talked about trace element supplementation for algae is definitely true. And based on the things I have, witnessed or talked to other reef keepers that are passionate about it, I personally haven't run into that issue. Maybe it's what I feed. Who knows, right? Like I haven't felt the need to dose.
Do you run
iron.
24/7 or RDP?
No, I would just reverse daylight.
Yeah,
so
see,
opposite
you're
schedule.
running RDP, old school style, sucking up the CO2 while the tank is, mostly breathing and not photosynthesizing. So you don't have those limiting nutrients nearly as much.
That's actually another good point, right? Because is an algae scrubber removing that CO2 enough, to your point, right? In terms of earlier, it's another way of binding up that CO2. But yeah, I mean, most people that have had a refugium have run into this weird thing where you'll see a patch of cyano in your fuge, but there's none in your tank, right? So there is this weird displacement effect where you've just moved the problem to the sump. I also think that the actual term refugium matters in the sense that I do feel like the reason an older tank has less problems is that you eventually have a diversity of microbes that are contributing to both being competitive, in terms of, especially when you're talking about like dinos and silicates and stuff, is you've introduced competition, right, with microbial life, and the other part is also they eat that crap, right? So I do imagine that if a fuge does properly function and keeping your pod population and everything sustainable, that may have some minute beneficial impact on your algae problems as well. Yeah,
I think
that's all
part of
I'll
your
say about that.
success is, and it brings just a joy to my eyes to know that you run your algae scrubber in the reverse
school.
daylight photosynthesis. Because when you run it 24/7, I think it's a lot easier for the macro and microalgae to run out of nutrients, as fast as you can add them, and you don't have to do a 12 straight 12/12. You could even do like 18 on, 6 off, but just giving them a little bit of a rest. And I think that's part of the reason for your success and some of those old school tricks of running it opposite of the aquarium to keep things more imbalanced. But one of the easiest thing to pick up off the shelf from your LFS or your online vendor is phosphate removers. It just seems like the most natural, easy thing to do. And I kind of want to start with the worst one. not necessarily the worst one, but it's not the solution that people are looking for. And I'm talking about lanthanum chloride.
Yeah, that's so dangerous, man.
It's dangerous. It has killed a lot of fish. It won't affect your corals so much, but it has been demonstrated by many experienced reefers that lanthanum chloride, you got to be careful. Never set it up on a doser. Do not set it up, like late in the afternoon and just wait till the next morning to see what happens. Like, you need to set that up and just kind of watch your tank. Go ahead and underdose it. Manually. Never set it up on a doser. Did I mention never set it up on doser? And don't set it up on multiple tanks at the same time. When you have no experience with it, you might lose multiple fish across multiple systems. This has been documented recently in the reef aquarium hobby, and lanthanum chloride is really most effective, and it makes the most sense on very large volumes of water.
Like a public aquarium or
with very high phosphates. And I know that many public aquariums actually use these on like mammal exhibits where the phosphates are just undetectable. They're so high.
yeah.
Unregisterable, off the scale, whatever. They're off the scale. They're used for like hippos and seals and sea lion exhibits, right? Because it's really good at bringing your phosphates down from 2 ppm almost to like 0.2 ppm, so 90% reduction. But 0.2 ppm, if you have a algae bloom, that's still plenty to fuel the growth. right? So it's not going to take you the extra distance, right? So if your phosphates are really riding that high, you need to do a water change, reduce your lighting, increase your nutrient export, use an automatic filter roll, clean your filter sock, remove your sand bed, and just do some of those pragmatic things first, right? But it's just so easy when you see it on the shelf at an aquarium shop. You're like, oh, just add some drops, reduces phosphates. Yeah, that's not exactly how it works. So it's really suitable for very large aquariums with higher phosphate levels. No hobby aquarists should really be using lanthanum chloride unless they really know what they're doing, or they're really trying to keep a lot of fish that they feed a lot in an average reef tank.
Yeah, I think the original use is for swimming pools, right? So again, large body of water. Yeah, and I'll make a personal opinion on a lot of this stuff, which may apply to people that are listening versus maybe not for others. But I'm just not good with tackling things that way, right? Like with something that you dose, where if you dose too much, it's you're in the danger zone. Like we talked on a podcast about the dangers of overdoing it.
That's still my favorite session to date.
Yeah, me too. And I
feel like it just answers all the questions. Don't overdo this. Don't overdo that. Anything you're thinking about doing, just don't overdo it, and you won't get in trouble. And lanthanum falls squarely in that Venn diagram. Just don't do it. Don't overdo it.
I'm the wrong guy to mess with that, right? Like I'd have to use like some really strong discipline not to overdo it. And that goes true with the other phosphate removers you're about to probably bring up. But I tried NOPOX, I tried carbon dosing, and finding the sweet spot where you're not overdoing it and bottoming things out and causing new problems versus dosing too little that it has very little impact. Like finding that sweet spot, I feel like it's sometimes so hard with a lot of those products that I keep trying. I keep getting excited by this stuff, but then it's usually ends up being a failed experiment for me. So.
Yeah, I know. I think there's something to be said for being really aggressive in the nutrient controls in the beginning days of a reef tank. That's when all the outbreaks want to happen, right? And it's only older aquariums where you have that microbial biology, that myofaunal biology, the macro creatures that you can actually see that can really help with the diversity of the reef aquarium, that you can get away with having higher phosphates and higher nitrates. Right. But in the early days when everything is trying to do some succession, it just doesn't work. So, you can add corals in the beginning. Like right now, I got the Fat Cube. It's 2 weeks old. Dude, we were going to do a video and just kind of summarizing this, just kind of hitting the highlights. It's been less than 2 weeks. We're already through the uglies.
Nice.
We've already passed it. Like literally week 1, a little bit of diatom growth, a little bit of extra this and that. Now we're just around the corner from 2 weeks, and they're gone. They're just simply gone. There's nothing even to show. So I'm like, okay, let's talk about this on Reef Therapy instead of the video format, because that way we can really dive in. Because in videos, I really want to illustrate what's going on. But in this particular aquarium, I used some aluminum oxide early on, also known as Phosguard, little white beads that have a little bit more long lasting power, and they seem to be able to bring the phosphates down lower. Whereas granular ferric oxide, GFO, has more capacity, but doesn't seem to be able to get the phosphates down as low as aluminum oxide. So like it works faster and has higher capacity, but aluminum oxide for me seems to work a little bit better over the long term. And we've already removed it. We ran it on there for like 4 or 5 days. Dude, it's got like 7 or 8 fish, 200 gallons, corals, fish, rock, and it just happened like that. But I'm going to describe a little bit more of like the herbivores. So we talked about lanthanum chloride. Unless you're in 4-digit volume reef tank, it's not ideal. It can work, especially if you have a ton of fish and you insist on feeding a ton of food and not rinsing your mysis shrimp. But next is, GFO is really common, widely available. I don't believe you need a dedicated media reactor, right? We already have sumps and overflows with a bunch of water flowing through. There's a lot of creative things you can do to just put a filter bag in there. A fine mesh filter bag.
And, again, I've never spent too much time tackling things from this angle, so maybe it's my lack of observation, me being a hermit and living in my little bubble in my house. But I run into a lot of reef keepers that talk about the effectiveness of GFO and aluminum oxide, and they use it because it lets them keep their phosphates at this ppm or ppb, right? And they're like, yeah, I know, I use it. I need to use it. Like I replace it this many times, and it brings my phosphates down and lets me keep it at let's just say 0.1 or 0.05 ppm, and I'm happy.
That sounds good.
Yeah, cool.
I think it's important to mention that a 0.1 to 0.05 ppm or milligrams per liter, that's a reasonable range to keep your phosphate at. We didn't mention that. I just want to throw it out there.
But I mean, did it fix a visual issue with the tank is my question, right? So the guys that are rigorous about testing their tanks, they're like, we're in the range I want to be at. Cool, mission accomplished. But did it fix some kind of problem? And that's where I'm always kind of curious. If your phosphates are at 5 and you bring them down to 1...
5 ppm?
Yeah.
Oh, you need to start over. If your phosphates are at 5, you just need to start over. I've never seen 5. I've seen 2. I think 5, you just need to quit.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think you can measure above 5. With aquarium test kits, it peaks at
Probably
around
not,
2 ppm.
What's Richard Ross's tank at? It's pretty
I think 1
high.
or 2.
Oh, okay. Anyway, question is, did they have an algae issue that they were able to resolve, or are they just happy that they're in the zone that they want to be in? Which isn't wrong, right? I think for certain people, targeting certain parameters is probably a great thing to do. I don't, right? I don't.
Don't tell people something is a great thing to do, and then both of us don't do it.
Well, I mean, there are metrics that you could say, oh, your water is good quality salt water in your reef tank. Like you have a nice, your corals are bathing in some quality water, right? But, but I just, did your Bryopsis disappear overnight? Or not overnight, but did it slowly starve out? Did you see? That's what I'd be interested in the comments, because I live in a bubble. I don't see a lot of other people's reef tanks very often, so maybe it's just a lack of observation on my part.
Some of the added benefits of granular ferric oxide and aluminum oxide are they don't just absorb phosphate, right? So GFO in particular has kind of a broad spectrum absorption curve where it will pull in some of the other nasties that you may not want to have in your aquarium. GFO is kind of really like a long-term chemical media that you can use in your aquarium, but excessive use of aluminum oxide, such as Phosgard and other similar, spherical white beads, is can also leach aluminum. So I really go to great lengths to soak I'll take a big old thing of the Brightwell version and soak it overnight. I'll soak it for days. I'll forget it for a week or two, soak it in some R water to help it leach some of that aluminum, because it can build up if you use too much, right? But it goes back to that episode we said, just don't overdo it. But you really want to rinse the aluminum oxide very, very well. And again, I like to soak it and just keep a small stockpile of it that's already pre-soaked and pre-rinsed really, really well. But they have some other benefits as far as like pulling out some heavy metals. And then one kind of a newer category that I actually have at the studio, but I've never had to use, and I'm not sure you're familiar with it, is there are some new resins. I think it's called Pure by Brightwell Aquatics, and I think MaxBect also has another one. And they are like aggressive and specific at pulling out phosphates. Again, I don't have algae problems. I dose phosphates because I need it for my corals, and so I haven't had the opportunity to use some of these ion-specific phosphate-removing resins. But there's a new class of these, and I don't know if they're rechargeable, but this is kind of like the bleeding edge of aggressive phosphate removal, right? And I guess we haven't talked, when we touched a little bit on kind of the carbon dosing, and man, that could be really effective. But I feel like it's also one of those things, if you starve out, like say, a new reef tank before you've put corals on there for like 2 months and just make it really ultra low nutrient system, just completely indetectable phosphates and nitrates for the first few months, as you start adding corals, man, it's going to be really hard for any algae to take hold, And so this is another thing, right? Like diatoms, dinos, probably unavoidable. But if you go to great lengths and take care to remove the bases off your coral colonies or the plugs from your coral frags, if you never introduce Valonia into your tank, you'll never have Valonia in your tank. It's just not like physically possible in this universe. Right? It just the DNA for that Valonia is not going to magically appear. There's always like a small piece of like living reef rock that you might not be able to get rid of. But if you never introduce Enteromorpha or Bryopsis or Debesia or Valonia, you'll never have it in your tank. Cyano, diatoms,
I do feel
dinos,
like what's the Jurassic Park line? Life finds a way,
That's where the diatoms and the dinos and cyano come in, right? Those spores are in the air. I live in the mountains, and those spores show up.
Yeah,
but
isn't watermelon snow? That's a cyano bloom on snow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
But that comes from duck poop or something like that. Like bird poop is from what I recall reading as well. But I don't know. You got fish poop. You got snail poop. You got. It's hard, man. I hear you. Like, I think it's a really good approach, right? Is just to not bring it in the first place, but eventually some microscopic cellular
Agree to disagree.
fragment might come in,
I also feel that there's also the dichotomy between getting it infected by bacteria and getting viral loading, right?
Yeah.
So even if you introduce a tiny bit,
that's a good
it's going to be harder for it to really take hold versus you're just adding all the bases and all the coral plugs and all the cleanup crew poop that is just going to inoculate your tank. And I feel like this is an awesome segue into the herbivores. One new stance I'm taking for my newer aquariums is being really mindful of what I'm adding to the tank from other reef tanks and what spores they might be introducing, right? That's why the 400-gallon tank doesn't have any stomatellas. I'd be surprised if there was a single copepod in that tank. It's been running for, what, are we going 3 months? I got 4 acros in there. Okay, it's probably a couple of copepods. But I have not seen anything beyond like a small amount of diatoms because they're in the air, right? And one of the best, awesome points you made on reef therapy, and probably one of the first 5 or 10 sessions, was the scientific research about herbivores. If you're on a natural reef and you take away the herbivores, algae explodes, right? So what we talked about, reducing the light and reducing the nutrients, and the nutrients is like more than half of this whole session, is prevention.
Yeah.
Right? And then once you have it, or leading up to it, herbivores are just really, really important. Do you want to elaborate on some of the things that you've said in the past?
Well, and this goes into something that's, I'm going to make a joke, is that maybe I'm the wrong guy to ever hit up for algae advice because I suck at keeping nanos.
No, you don't. Your nano was fine.
No, I'm terrible at them. But the reason for that is that the availability of herbivores, if you have a sizable tank, aka tangs, right? It's a game changer to me, right? Like my success as a reef hobbyist hinges very much on being able to keep herbivorous fish, right? Snails are great. Don't get me wrong, and we can get into.
No, they're not. We'll get into it. But I'm with you on the herbivory and how important it is. Carry on.
So yeah, and that's the problem with me when I set up a 5-gallon tank. I can't put a tang in it, right? I mean, I could, but it'd be pretty bad. So once you get into a 75-gallon tank, and please, tang police, don't shoot me.
Are they even still functioning, the tank police?
I didn't know that they had meetings, but just once you get into a tank size where you don't feel guilty keeping like a bristle-tooth tang and a zebrasoma, man, algae management gets so much easier. It's they're just lawnmowers, so
they will do a lot of heavy lifting. This is a fact.
And so and that's where when I set up a small tank, throwing a Mithrax crab in there and some Astrea snails doesn't quite cut it. That said, I have a newfound love for snails. Well, not newfound, it's been a year, I guess, but there was a point where my gyres were they were, like you said, they were too high for the tanks to get on them, and they were getting a little turfy, right? But my take on it is whenever I've got turf growing in the hard-to-reach areas, guess what? I don't have a cyano or a dino issue, and so my tank is sort of like that reef you described, where they preclude any herbivores from getting access to a section of a reef, right? Like that's my gyre pump, right? Like the herbivores can't get to it. But I got, I love Mexican turbos, even though they're very short-lived. Man, I ordered a couple of those, put them on the actual pumps, and the next day those pumps were clean, spotless. I was like, you guys actually do eat algae. Like, yeah, pretty cool. So,
I didn't include this in the show notes, but if you feed the shit out of your fish, why would they eat like bitter, nasty, tough algae?
Yeah. They're like, I got this nori sheet right here, man.
I'm just going to let that sink in for a moment. If you feed your kid ice cream, why would he or she eat broccoli? Right? So that's another thing. Like I feed very moderately. And for most of my tanks, say 3 feet and above, I like to include 3 types of surgeonfish. I want one zebrasoma, usually a yellow or scopus. I want one Tinochetus. Tommy is my boy for that. The flame fin Tominiensis. They just have a kind of a bristle-toothed mouth that they really help scrape. And then I want one Acanthurus. And that's usually for me is a convict tang, because you can get them small and they get bigger, but they don't get as huge as like the big Acanthurus. And then I'll have some blue tangs and some other tanks, but they're a little bit more open water swimming. Like they'll chew on stuff, but I see them, like I have this one that just recently developed this bad habit of fragging corals and dropping the branch somewhere else, like far from where it could drop. And you've heard this before, right?
Oh,
You've heard of blue tangs, like just grabbing a branch and moving it somewhere else.
Oh man, I had to rehome mine because it, again, this was another reason why I have taller walls on my new tank, is it was splashing water over the wall of the tank. It acted more like a triggerfish. I don't know if that's a good, it reminded me of just a bored triggerfish, So, yeah.
So I would say the blue tang is like the least algae eating. They're like comparable to the swallowtail angelfish.
You're talking about Hepatus, right?
Paracanthurus.
Yeah.
Hepatus, regal blue tang, royal blue tang, dory.
Dory.
Okay. Dory, there you go. But yeah,
Not the Atlantic blue tang, which is actually a really good algae grazer. But
yeah. One small nose tang like a yellow or a zebra or a scopus, one bristlemouth tang like a coal or a tomany, and then the convict tang. And together they complement each other.
Yeah.
And they really just that's what's left. Yeah, I can't believe I forgot to put fox faces and rabbitfish on here. The only problem with those guys is they are a little bit too into it. And they will start eating green corals. And this is not rare. It's not common, but it's also not rare. Like you hear this about, especially about fox faces, right? So in a tank that grows a lot of algae, like a fox face or an actual rabbitfish will do a lot of heavy lifting. I only have one rabbitfish. I have 20 reef tanks. I only have one rabbitfish. I'm not super fond of them.
Yeah.
But I used to be. I used to really, really be. And so, yeah, having those three different mouths from the surgeonfish and then like one fox face or rabbitfish style fish is going to help to really just graze down every surface.
And I'd say one of the best algae eating tanks, but they just get so big so fast, are the sailfins, because the Desjardins will eat bubble algae in my experience, and I've had multiple sailfins eat bubble algae, so it's not
my
just
yellow
the
tangs
weird
eat
one.
bubble algae.
Do they?
Yeah,
Nice.
because I don't feed them that much.
Yeah.
It goes back to not overfeeding, not giving them a choice. They get one feeding per day, maybe twice a day. They probably get about 10 feedings a week. Right? So some days I get a little bit to supplement their diet, but man, I swear I'll be on my frag rack and I'll pull up a coral or frag plug and they'll finally have access to a piece of that crate they have to. I've seen my yellow tangs just straight go for it. And I can concur with the proclivity of Desjardins tangs, Red Sea sailfin tangs, eating bubble algae pretty well also. But I think it's not so much of species level things, although the Red Sea sailfins are maybe a little bit better at it because I've had purple tangs also do it. If you just feed a little less, they'll develop a taste, an appetite for things that just naturally grow in the aquarium.
Yeah, I've had another one that eats it really well is Doliatus rabbitfish, but again, they get big, and I had to rehome mine because he started munching on coral and just not worth the
Have you
benefit.
noticed them eating green corals?
Man, it was a while ago.
Because when I've had challenges with fox faces and rabbitfishes eating corals, they were almost always green. They're like, oh, this is green. I'm supposed to eat green algae. Let me try this out.
Mine was going for fleshy LPS, but
No.
I don't remember what color they were. It was a while ago, but yeah, it's just. But with the thing about Valonia is, I got like a plastic stick that's, I don't know, polyethylene or whatever, like the kind that you used to order to drill holes in live rock and make live rock towers and stuff, whatever was recommended to do that back in the day. I had some extra ones of those, drilled a hole in one end carefully, so I didn't drill into my hand, wedged a nail into it with some super glue. It probably would have been better to do like a few, right, to almost create like a prong or something, but just every once in a while I just go around my tank and I pop all the bubble algae, and the whole myth that creates more bubble algae I think has been disproven, that there's no spores in there.
No, I overhear this at reef shops all the time. This is a simple thought experiment. When your emerald crab eats bubble algae, it pops the bubble.
Right.
When your tangs eat bubble algae, they pop the bubble. This whole myth, like if you knew how many spores these things put out, you realize it just doesn't even matter whether it's 10,000 or a million spores. It just doesn't matter. Don't forget about the spores. We'll talk about the medieval stuff here in a little bit.
Well, but the point about the grazers was, I think the whole bubble growth is to make it harder for, let's say, a convict tang to eat it, right? But once you pop it, it's like ulva, right? It's just this like leafy thing attached to the rock, and they go in and they devour it. So
that's an incredible point that I've never even thought about. Because if I pop up bubble algae, it's because I'm in there taking it out. But you're right. Pop it, and when it's less than a few millimeters across, it makes it a lot easier for the fish to chew on it. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not this giant hamburger that doesn't fit in your mouth, right? So, anyway.
That's a cool point. I actually learned something.
Just pop that stuff, man.
Pop that stuff, manually remove it.
Yeah.
So the tangs and surgeonfish, they get a lot of props for being herbivores. But think about it. There's like 10, 20,000 species of marine fish. You think surgeonfish are the only ones that figured out how to eat algae?
Right.
Come on now.
Yeah.
Come on now. And every time we dive deep in some of these stuff, I feel like there's a lot of forgotten knowledge about herbivory or just any other technique about reef tanks. And like lawnmower blennies, they'll eat some algae. I feel like it's deceptive because like lawnmower makes it seem like they're just going to approach a patch of hair algae and just mow it down like a lawn, but that's not true. But they will, especially if the rock is cleaner, they'll keep it grazed down to the point where algae won't grow, right?
Yeah.
And I think all but a few like specialized blennies like Myacanthus and some of the imitator blennies, a lot of your I'm spacing out on names real quick. The Acinius blennies, like if you grow little diatoms on your glass, they're always going to be kissing the glass. So a lot of blennies
lipstick marks,
yeah, they will totally do this. They'll leave almost an identical mark to a bristletooth tang, right? So a lot of blennies will eat some algae. They're just not the powerhouses of a surgeonfish, right? So they're a little bit better for smaller tanks. But on the note of smaller tanks, it used to be very widely known that Rainford and Hector's gobies, really small, little, Amblygobius species, will eat the bejesus out of some algae, right? The dragon goby is probably the most tenacious, like tough hair algae eater, right? I don't see dragon gobies at my local fish store anymore.
Yeah,
I don't.
That's true. That's a good point.
It's been a long time since I've just seen like people used to come into my store when I worked like 10, 15 years ago in the reef aquarium retail space, and I would sell so many dragon gobies because they're super hardy, super cheap, not very pretty, but it's very utilitarian. But if you're leaning more towards like a nano aquarium, Rainfords and Hectors, man, they're the same thing in a smaller package and a much prettier package.
And they're, again, unlike tangs, I would say, don't expect them to like mow down an inch of turf, right? You got to be in there and go medieval again, to overuse that word. And then they're like the cleanup crew that comes in after and kind of keeps it at that new shortened level, is the way I always
like a crime scene cleanup. You get rid of the body, they get rid of the blood.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking the same thing.
Really?
Yeah, the crime scene cleanup. Like they come in with the bottles of bleach,
So I feel like also so I think those are the main aquarium herbivores. Of course, butterfly fish and Moorish idols, angelfish will graze them some algae, but they're not going to put in some good 40-hour work week, if we can put it that way. But I feel like cleanup crew is also a misnomer because a lot of the cleanup crew, very few things actually target the algae. They're more about eating up the leftover food, stirring up detritus, maybe picking out a little bit of algae, right? And I'm talking about, your snails, your crabs, and your hermit crabs. Emerald crabs, they will do some work on some tough algae, but they don't move very fast. And for some reason, I keep finding them in my stylophoras where there's no algae. I'm like, what are you doing, bro? There'll be like two of them in the same colony. I'm like, what are you doing? You are not a trapezia crab. You are not a coral crab. What are you doing in there?
And they're, in my experience, omnivorous, right? So, because I've had them do a good number slowly on Valonia, and I'm like, yay, all right, this is my new Red Sea Selfin for nano tanks. And then all of a sudden you're like, why are you ripping out my corals? Like I've seen them eat a leather coral, which I thought was a bit surprising. Yeah, I'm like, well, who wants to eat a leather coral? But one of the old Colorado green polyp leathers, man, that thing was going to town on it. I'm like, okay.
Probably because it didn't have other things to eat, right? So in the same note that like you don't want to satiate the appetite of your surgeonfish so that they develop a taste and palate for a wider variety of things that already go in your tanks. If you go too far, your emerald crabs will eat anything.
There's the other extreme, right?
If you put an emerald crab with an acro or a cinerina or a micromusa, and there's nothing else to eat, they will eat it. But they're not coral eaters. They're just, like you said, omnivorous. They will just do whatever they can. And, shrimp will also, shrimp probably don't get nearly enough credit as far as like being a cleanup crew. Probably because the industry is trying to drive the hobby, and there's just shrimp a little bit more expensive and delicate, and no one wants to really keep anything but peppermint shrimp specifically for aptasia removal. But a lot of these things are omnivorous. And so most of your cleanup crew, like Nosarius, perfect example, they just live in your sand. They'll stir it up a little bit, and they're going to eat food that falls on the sand, and they'll consume some of the stuff that makes its way inside the sand, right? Sand dollars used to be a thing, right? But they're mostly omnivorous, and they're still part of a cleanup crew because they're kind of keeping things clean. Same thing with the sand sifting starfish. They're keeping things clean to a point where hopefully those nutrients don't build up and don't fuel algae growth. But they're not so much of like a direct algae eaters. Some of the snails will do great work at first, but like you said, it's just like kind of a really short shelf life. I have 20 reef tanks and I have 4 snails. Each one of them hitchhiked on something and just survived with a will to live. And now I only have like 4 very big snails. I haven't even looked at them closely to know which species because I'm more focused on my abalones. Love my abalones.
Yeah, but those are hard to get, man. Like the ones you have.
I know a guy in Bali, and he made sure to send a shipment to California, and I made sure to get most of those. But now I have enough abalones. But those are amazing. Dude, they will destroy. They are lawnmowers. They will literally mow down a lawn in a larger aquarium, but they need more food, right? So you can't put an abalone in a small tank. You're talking about a 4-foot tank minimum for an abalone. Right? Because they will run out of food, and that's no good. And you know what's really funny? Finding my 6-inch long abalones on what's left over of my nori clip. That's always super funny. So I've got this one especially large specimen. I mean, it is literally the size of my hand. Like if I was starving, I could literally eat it, and it would probably taste delicious. She also likes to squirt eggs out of the tank about once a month. We find green splooge. I am not kidding. Green splooge outside the tank, hits the lights, hits the skimmers, hits the back wall, hits the stand. Like, I don't know how far she's squirting, but I do have a male in another tank, and it's a good thing they're separated because I've heard it's like a giant clam spawn. If they get together, it's just not a good time. She splooges outside the tank. But I got some smaller ones, but I'm on this kick, man. Like, the industry is trying to lead the hobby. Why is no one selling stomatellus?
I love stomatellus.
Didn't Indo-Pacific Sea Farms used to sell stomatellus?
Maybe. I know they used to sell this other snail, and they may still do it, that they look like tiny little conchs, but they don't get much bigger. I forget the genus, man. I'm sorry.
Dude, stomatellus are freaking magic for, like, the surface stuff.
Yeah.
That is one of the few things that I really go out of my way to introduce into new aquariums. They're so easy to harvest. I just pull out a flat coral or a flat plate or a flat frag rack, and they're always just clustered under there, big ones.
And they're fast.
I spread them out everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. And the only reason they're not sold in the reef aquarium hobby is they're not straightforward to culture. But they are incredible. I have one tank that grows a certain amount of like biofilm. It has a coral banded shrimp in there, and he eats any stomatellas I put in there.
Yeah, they used to be a mainstay in my tank, and I haven't. Every once in a while I may see one, but I have a feeling something's eaten mine, which
coral
is a
banded
shame.
Shrimp, or if you have
shrimp in my tank.
kind of a heavy metal spike, it will nuke them out. But yeah, the only tank that has kind of a persistent biofilm is the one that I keep a blue-legged coral banded shrimp in, because he will hunt them down and eat them. There's not a single coral banded shrimp in there. I'm sorry, there's not a single stomatella in there because he will eat them. But then I have another tank that has a large pair of regular coral banded shrimp. I don't have any stomatellas in there, but I got a field of Asterinas. I think I have at least 3 different species of Asterinas here. And you know what? Sometimes they eat coral. Sometimes they do. And they don't just sit there and devour the whole freaking thing in one sitting, right? They'll just start picking at the edge. And it's like they get programmed. Aquilonastra starfish. That's the new name, the Aquilonastra starfish. Asterinas, colloquially. And I will occasionally have to pull out a handful of them off a coral because they just get like in this programmed state where like, oh, I'm going to eat this thing now. But in my, Red Sea Peninsula aquarium, which is just packed end to end with corals, I think I just took out like 2 or 3 pounds of stony coral out of it because it was just too much. They don't go to town, but once in a while they just kind of get flipped on, like a switch flips on. They're like, okay, we're eating this coral, but they do it really slowly from the edge, and I can just literally pull off the offending Asterinas, and 6 months later, like no problem at all.
I haven't had any issues with them.
One thing I have noticed is if I dose phosphates a little bit too much, the Asterina population kind of booms a little bit.
Blows up.
Which is a direct indication that they're not only eating uneaten food, but they're also directly eating algae.
Right. Those little microalgae spikes that you're getting on the glass, which is why they crawl up the glass, I think, at night, right? Is they're less predation, I think. Maybe they're a bit more nocturnal. And like every morning I go downstairs, fill up the coffee machine, and like my glass is just littered with the Asterinas. I don't keep zoanthids, so maybe that's why I know a lot of folks have complained about them irritating zoanthids. I've never seen them eat a coral, so they, other than just being there and kind of being annoying sometimes, they don't bother me. I'd say the 2 herbivores that I always use that I don't really see a lot of people talk about in the invert stage, one is I like Mexican turbos. I have a few that are like 3 to 5 years old. So, and I keep my tanks above 80. So, the whole temperate species, I don't know. But I think part of the problem is like, you don't need 30 of them. Like my 180 has
That's
5.
the other thing. The whole like number of snails or cleanup crew per gallon. Like, come on, guys.
No. Order the 10-gallon kit for your 180.
Yes, absolutely. That's an awesome point, actually. But I'm glad you like turbos.
The other one is pincushions. Do you like urchins?
Oh, God, I love urchins, man. I love urchins.
But the whole tuxedo thing, like, I've done tuxedos, and I like me some pincushion urchins, man.
I'm a little bit more of a tuxedo guy. The only thing I don't like is when they pick up corals.
Oh,
and they walk around with them,
which
is cool on its own, but then they take that piece of acro or Euphilia or green star polyp or zoanthid and they walk around and they accidentally sting stuff. It's not the end of the world. It is not a deal breaker. I'm a little bit more of a tuxedo guy, but yeah, those short spine sea urchins and even long spine sea urchins, that is the most devourous cleanup crew you can possibly get. Right, 1 urchin is worth like 10 to 20 snails. And it's likely to outlive them all. It's going to get bigger if you get like a long spine or a diadema that like just kind of comes with your rock or something, or your coral. Like you're going to have to get rid of it. Like that's how big it will get. Versus turbo snails, like you'd be lucky to have 2 out of 10 survive past 6 months. I don't know the answer, but that's why I've just stuck to Asterinas and Stomatellas that reproduce on their own. They are not part of the conversation because they cannot be sold, because you have to manually scoop them up and harvest them.
I think the reason the time that Mexican turbos earned a permanent place in my tank was I don't know the genus name of this algae anymore. I wrote about it a crap ton on Reef Central back in the day, but the cotton candy algae is what we called it.
Yes, the
It's the
hairy
reason
cyanobacteria.
well, it's like almost like a fern where it has a sporophyte phase, and then it has a more leafy phase, I believe. But we only got like the fuzzy phase in our tanks. I think this, if I recall, this is what made Sanjay reboot his 180 at one point.
I remember this. Yeah, the cotton candy algae.
And I mean, I tried everything back then to get rid of it, and I was on, grasping at straws. And then somebody recommended Mexican turbos, and I put them in my tank, feeling bad that they would probably be short-lived, and they just mowed that crap down. And I was like, okay. And now I have a few that are a few years old, and I don't know if it's a temperature thing. I wonder if it's just that they starve out because they're big-ass snails. So again, maybe if you only put like 2 or 3 in a tank, which is what I do, they hang around longer. Like maybe this whole temperate argument is sort of a falsehood, and maybe it's just they get hungry.
You know what? The rest of the hobby can figure out what's wrong with the snails, and I'm fully content with my abalones, my stomatellas, my asterinas. Like they fill the niche that I need. And it's so funny though that cotton candy algae, how did we all get it at the same time?
And now you don't see it anywhere anymore.
Now it's gone.
Yeah,
now I have cotton candy coralline. I have like tiny little patches of coralline. I think Mike Paletta recently talked about having issues with it. And I'm like, I don't know if he just doesn't have a variety of herbivores, but like I know I have it in my tanks. If I made a box and kept everything out of it, like it would grow there. But like very few spots I can actually find it. And it was when I started up the coral flats, like I could find it in certain spaces, and I was starting to worry that it might be like cotton candy algae, but it was like 20 years ago. We all got cotton candy at the same time, probably from the Caribbean, from lots of Caribbean influence, and now it's gone. Now it's just gone. And you know what? It'll come back again, and no one will bother to read the threads from 10 to 20 years ago about how we all solved it.
Yep. Yeah, and it's the same, that whole how the battlefield has changed over time is why I get annoyed when people talk about dinos like it's 2002. Like, oh, just do a blackout. It's just one of those things that happens when you first set up a tank. It's like, no, man.
No.
There's support groups for dinos for a reason, like name an algae that has a Facebook support group.
None of these books talk about dinoflagellates in any context other than zooxanthellae for your corals.
Right.
So, like if I went through there would be no mention of dinoflagellates as a bloom inside your tank. This is kind of a newer phenomenon. I firmly think it's from keeping our tanks too cool. And I know there's different species, and it doesn't work all the way, but, on my LPS tank, I raised the temperature a little bit, actually added a heater, so it wasn't running it down 72. That's where it was running. It was running more like 75, 76. I had some iron, kind of just forgot about it, and like a month later, I'm like, oh, there's not a trace anymore. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm eating crow on that, and now diving into the various types of dinos that everyone is battling that's different, and these guys respond to UV, but these guys bury themselves in your substrate at night, and they don't become free swimming, so UV doesn't do
Not
squat.
if you don't have substrate.
Well, but my point is, I was firmly like, hey, temperature worked for me, but now I, again, have a strain that doesn't give a crap that I ran my tank at 84 degrees even.
That's pretty warm. That's actually tropical.
And it's weird that I've got a tank upstairs where it's a mucky, dirty tank with Cato growing in the sump and crushed coral substrate and some tangs roaming, and everything's beautiful. And then I've got a tank down here where I've got a filter roller, a skimmer, some dead rock, right? And I've got dinos. And so I'm going old school. Like I pulled the filter roller for now. I think that
you pulled the filter roller?
I almost feel like we were talking about things you do in the beginning and not do in the beginning, and I'm starting to think that when your tank is too sterile and there's not enough microbial life and there's not enough going on competitively under a microscope.
Did you physically pull it out?
I did.
You know,
I debated taking out
you could just
the
open
roll.
the wind. You
Or
could also
the-
just
open
there's a
the little nozzle.
bypass.
No,
You just
I
open the bypass.
completely yanked it for now. And I'm just skimming wet, and I'm dosing Phyto. I'm adding, I'm adding copepods. I'm even dosing silicates, right, to get a little bit of diatom competition. So we'll see. But now I'm going to go backpack for 9 days, and the tank's on its own. So, maybe I'm lucky and I come back and the world has resolved it for me. Just
I
the
think that's
universe.
what's going to happen.
Be great.
You stop messing with
I
it.
know.
And for 10
The
days,
solution
you're going to come
was-
back. You're going to be like, oh my God, it's crystal clear. And every coral
Yeah.
looks amazing.
The tank's like, oh, thank God he's gone. All right.
He keeps changing something every
He
day or
keeps
two.
freaking with the temperature. He's like, man. Yeah. Anyway.
All right, we got one more section. I hope, everyone listening has enjoyed all the things that we've discussed, because I think we've touched on like every single trick except for going medieval on these mofos. And I think it can't be overstated that if we're talking about not dinos, not cyano, but like actual hairy hair algae, manual removal is just great. All right, for example, here's a perfect example. I have grown my own kale before, and if I wanted the kale to taste really, really good, I would water the hell out of it for like 2 days in advance and then only harvest the top. It was just sweet and mild and soft. And if I didn't water it really well in the summertime, obviously when it's growing, and then I harvested it, it'd be like a lot more bitter and a lot more tough. And so, we didn't mention mollies as an algae eater.
Oh, yeah.
I was
That's
just
a
thinking
good
about
point.
that. In some calmer aquariums, the freshwater come saltwater Poecilia latipina mollies, they can be some really great algae eaters. They're just going to struggle with the tougher stuff, but they will consume anything. They're just like cows. I'm sorry, I don't know why that flashed in my head as I was talking about this. And so it's the same thing with algae. If you pull out the older stuff and you offer your herbivores more new growth with a little bit brighter green tips, they're just going to be so much more inclined, and they're going to be together. You can form a team with your herbivores, your cleanup crew, your abalones, your stomatellas, your turbo snails, your surgeonfish, and together you could win the game against hair algae. Right? But if you kind of clear cut it and just present them with some new growth and feed a little bit less, they're going to be so much more inclined to go for it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think,
Not to mention, removing the algae is nutrient export.
It
right?
is.
It's like having algae scrubber not where you want it, but every time you pull it out, you're just pulling out everything that hair algae needs to grow.
well, and I keep going back to these words, but, maybe it's the ecology, biology degree, right? That just keeps bubbling up in my brain. But
Oh, don't hold back.
it's all of it is competition, right? It's all of these organisms are competing to etch out an existence in your tank. And sometimes for me, the way I look at it too is you got 100 people in a road race and they're all running, right? But one of them keeps getting body checked like every mile, and that's the turf algae, and that's you going in there and getting medieval, right? But all the other microorganisms and myoorganisms, micromyofauna, all the corals are starting to get their jive going. The coralline algae, they're all in this race, right? And a race is a bad analogy because there's no destination, but they're all competing, right? They're all competing for things. But you're the guy or girl that's body checking the algae every time and knocking it down, and it has to get up. And
I love that analogy.
This is a horrible scientific argument, I guess, but I feel like you're shifting the balance gradually, competitively, to the things that you are okay with succeeding in your tank, right? And that you want winning the race, right? So yeah, I'm all for that.
Yeah, no, it can't be overstated that when you're in the depths of it, just work on it yourself. You can use, I think a really good approach is using a little bit of rigid tubing at the end of a tube of like a hose to help kind of scrape it down. I know in the past, we would just talk about all these different hacks to manually remove it. Put zip tie a toothbrush to the end of your hose or your rigid airline to kind of scrub it and suck it at the same time. I don't think those Kong, like kind of spaghetti spinner things are available anymore, but those worked really freaking well. I'm sure someone could DIY one once again. But yeah, just manual removal. And then if you want to take things up a notch, sterilizing the water. I mean, this is like next level. This is when you really have tried a lot of stuff. But this stuff is actually kind of good to use in the beginning. Once again, if you get ahead of it, just like you've talked about ecological succession, you get ahead of it with the UV sterilizer and or ozone, you're killing the spores that are trying to spread everywhere. And you're reducing some of those organics and helping your protein skimmer to export those nutrients before they turn into algae. You do a combination of all the things we've talked about, your algae's gone. Like that's it's just done. You reduce the photoperiod, reduce your feeding, take out your sand bed, add an algae crew, add some phosphate remover, go to medieval on it, remove it yourself, use a UV sterilizer. It's just a matter of time.
Well,
right?
Who was it? Marcellus Wallace in Pulp Fiction mentioned tweezers, right? Stainless steel tweezers when he said he was going to go medieval, right? But seriously, like some good stainless. Yeah. Well, I mean, you could blow torch your rock, I guess, out of water, but no, but some good stainless steel tweezers that have like really good grippy. Just it sounds tedious, but just go in at a patch and just pick that.
Dude, it's
cathartic.
Stuff.
Oh yeah.
Dude, once in a while, I got a freshwater tank, I got my staghorn algae growing in there, and I'll just drink a little bit of beer and have some very nice ADA tweezers about $40. Like 15 years ago, they're still like rust free. They got a little bit of ridges on the very tip, and it's just cathartic. Just pull out a little bit here and just kind of separate it from the plants. And but yeah, there's some other things that you can do. Like obviously everyone knows about ChemiClean for cyanobacteria. There's a treatment for Bryopsis specifically called fluconazole.
Yeah.
Reflux, I think, is one of the commercially available products, and I think a few other products are on the market with some variation of those syllables that will destroy Bryopsis specifically. Brightwell Tech M is an evolution of a Kent Marine product that was also magnesium that had some kind of slight contaminant that just so happened to eradicate Bryopsis. That stuff will also not make other algae happy. Right? It will kill Bryopsis, but other algae will not be happy if you dose Brightwell Tech M. Oh my God, I think Tech M was the Kent Marine name. I think I'm confused. I think it's called something else now under Brightwell. But there is a Brightwell product that's a specific magnesium that just has the added side effect of killing Bryopsis. And in the early days, you and I talked a little bit about Brightwell Razor, which is probably analogous to Vibrant. I don't know about I know Vibrant has been shown to be an actual algicide, but I don't know about Brightwell Razor. And I think once again, this is one of those products that's probably best used in the early days of a reef tank to just really clean the rock. Like you mentioned it before, like when you use Brightwell Razor, your rock just looks amazing. Just looks like the rock, and the coralline is fine and everything else is fine. But all of a sudden, there's just not a trace of algae or biofilm, and it's really astounding. I know that Brightwell Razor is going to be more talked about in the future. It's been on the market for 3 years. It was kind of introduced in the early days of the Reef Builder Studio, but I think there's something to be said about summoning someone coming up with a recipe where you use Brightwell Razor in the early days to just really level the playing field. So that way, once you add your Surgeonfish and you have your ecology under control and your cleanup crews installed, this will be an afterthought. You won't have a problem anymore.
I think, yeah, like you said, vibrance and algicide, and I think what I heard about Razor is it's like a polymer that coats your rocks and makes it hard for turf algae and stuff to adhere to the rock.
Yeah, but there's more to it than that, because it literally killed my Valonia, and it killed every trace of green algae that I had. So I believe that it's a polymer, but it goes deeper than that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting product, and I don't. Yeah, when it comes to something like Bryopsis, for example, I don't have any beef with using fluconazole. Same reason I don't have any beef with using. I'm gonna guess it's metronidazole or something like that, or no, erythromycin that is in like some red slime removers. And there's nothing that's going to eat Bryopsis effectively, right? There's nothing that's going to eat cyano, which is not an algae. But again, sometimes you just got to shift that competitive landscape a bit. You got to body check the thing you don't like, and that gives that other thing that wasn't doing so well in the race kind of it's cheating, I guess you could say. But it's like now they get a chance to sort of succeed. There ain't nothing wrong with that. UV sterilizer. I notice, and a lot of people notice, the microalgae film in your glass becomes less of an issue when you run UV, right? I had sort of the opposite experience where I took my UV off my tank, and I think that allowed more success in the green microalgae space. So I actually saw a positive net because that weird red turfy stuff that was growing on my rocks not my rocks, but my crushed coral substrate when you came to visit, gone after I pulled my UV. So again, I'm tweaking who's winning and who's losing, right? Are they related to me pulling the UV? I don't know. But I pulled the UV. I go to Colorado to visit you. I come back and the tank looks a little bit better. Now, 6 months later, maybe I regret that decision, right? And I want to put the UV back on. But I think they're all just tools, and you just got to kind of tweak things. I think you and I are coming at it from different angles because you like to keep things really clean, like
coral centric.
Right. Like you're a pretty good bouncer on your reef tank on who gets to come in. You don't use a sand bed, and I'm more like the old. I like that bit of micro diversity, and that just seems to work for me. So, like I've said a million times, if I see a little turf algae on a return nozzle, I'm cool, right?
It's when there's absolutely normal, even in the cleanest of tanks.
Exactly. I think this tank down here is being a little pain in the butt because there ain't no turf algae in the places the tanks can't get to, right? So, I don't know. It's all just levers that you're going to pull.
I feel like this session of Reef Therapy is probably one of the episodes that's most re-listenable. If you are having algae issues, this is one of those sessions that's worth a couple listens, because I guarantee you that if you use most or all of these tools, hair algae will be a memory. And it's one of those things you don't just wake up one day like, oh my God, algae's gone. It's just, a few weeks, a few months go by and I'm like, oh my God, all of a sudden my hair algae's gone. Yeah. It's a common problem, and it goes back to overdoing it, right? We did a whole session overdoing it. It's one of the most important and most poignant topics I think I've ever covered in reef therapy and reef builders on YouTube, and it's just so important. This was an important one to really get out there. And as far as the UV sterilizer, the one thing that I will tell you is that a lot of service companies who really only visit a reef aquarium or saltwater aquarium once a week, maybe twice a week, they're all going to use a UV sterilizer because they know it's going to knock everything back.
Yeah.
Right? The aquarium service companies are like this shadow part of the reef aquarium industry, the saltwater aquarium industry that has like zero voice. I really want to learn more about their tricks, because it's one of those things you see over and over and over again when fish-only tanks, reef-only tanks, or foulers are set up. There's a lot of ultraviolet sterilization being used by the service community, because they can only go out there once a week, and for some high-profile clients, everything has to go very, very well, right? But your point is also valid about removing the UV and encouraging a little bit more ecology to happen, to where the competition just takes over what you didn't want to grow.
Yeah,
right?
and I mean, to be fair, I had no idea this would happen, right? And I can't prove that the two things are corollary, but maybe the point I'm trying to make is, sometimes it's a little bit of experimentation to try to figure out, where are you going to get how are you going to be able to start to shift things to the point that you want, right? So, I love UV sterilizers. That's one thing that I never used, and I don't use it on this tank down here, but a properly functioning UV sterilizer has a lot of really strong benefits, and I'm in a phase where I'm trying to remove a bunch of gadgets from my tank, right? Because again, my tank's at a point where things are sort of churning on their own now, autopilot, right? So now I kind of want to pull off a bunch of the gadgets and just
that's a great point. There's certain things that we do in the early stages of a reef tank, like go heavy on your herbivory, go heavy on your cleanup crew, go a little bit more methodical about your phosphate absorption or your carbon dosing. This whole session is just a guide. I don't think we've left any stone unturned when it comes to how you can approach algae, but a lot of things we discussed can be temporary.
Yeah.
They can be initializing your reef tank. And then once you get to a certain point, you don't need so much cleanup crew. A lot of it will die out. Hopefully not the surgeonfish.
Right.
You don't need a UV sterilizer forever. You don't need ozone generator. You don't need GFO and all these little tips and tricks forever, right? And so this is why I think that this particular session is worth a second listen for someone who's really trying to tackle the problem.
Yeah, and listen to it while you're going medieval with some tweezers and
yes, exactly.
Get that Zen moment going. Not Pulp Fiction. Be a little more Zen about it, right? But so
yeah, no, that's the best outro I can think of. Mark, thank you for joining me on this session of Reef Therapy. I think we're both going to take a little bit of summer break for a little bit, and we'll probably see you guys again in late August. And thank you so much to all the fans for helping us get to our 50th episode. This is half 100.
That's
it
crazy.
Sounds better when you say half 100 versus 50. But it's probably 75 hours of listening if you go through them all. And there's a couple of special episodes in there. So make sure to like us and rate us on your favorite podcatcher. If you're in New South Wales or Sydney, make sure to come see us at Reefstock Australia. Go to reefstock.show for more information. And Mark and I will be back at it, giving you some proper reef aquarium therapy at the end of the summer. And until then, we'll catch you guys on the next one.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll have a lot to talk about then too, so that'll be cool.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah. All right.
Later, buddy.